Welcome to the Financial Planning for Canadian Business Owners podcast. You will hear about industry insights with award-winning financial planner and entrepreneur Jason Pereira. Through the interviews with different experts with their stories and advice, you will learn how you can navigate the challenges of being an entrepreneur, plan for success, and make the most of your business and life. And now, your host, Jason Pereira.
Hello and welcome. Today on the show, I have David Prowse of Velorum Business Advisory. I brought David on the show specifically to talk about business valuation, what the issues are surrounding getting your business to maximum value, and how to make the most of your business valuation. And with that, here's my interview with David Prowse. David, thanks for taking the time today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure. So let's just clarify one thing off the bat. You are not the actor who played Darth Vader.
No, I'm not, and he's no longer alive. So thankfully, I am still alive. But no, I do get those questions from time to time from people who are obviously big Star Wars fans.
I was just watching on the weekend with my son, so it's top of mind. Okay, so David Prowse of Velorum, tell us about what it is you do for a living.
Okay, so essentially, my business is centered around what I would call an exit planning business that does a little bit of valuation, a little bit of value acceleration, exit planning, and a little bit of corporate finance. And by that, I mean sort of fractional CFO work. And I'll tell you a little bit about my background. So I'm a Canadian CPA by background. I got my CPA, or formerly chartered accountant, back in the day in 1996. And, did most of my career, early part was very much centered around your typical CA stuff. And then later on, around 2015, I got involved with some corporate finance and valuation work. And it was around there that my mind kind of really started tweaking into just the whole concept of value creation, especially for business owners who are looking to grow and exit their business. So I got involved a little bit later on with the Exit Planning Institute in the US and got my certification down there, which is the CPA after my name, Certified Exit Planning Advisor. And, ran into other people who were kind of in the field. And so I decided what I wanted to do is really run a practice that's just solely focused in on middle market businesses to help them grow and successfully exit their business over whatever time frame they're looking at, which is usually going to be, let's say, 3 to 10 years. And the reason I got into it is there's some sobering factors out there that I think are really important. And so I really kind of felt that there was a big need in the marketplace for these services. So I'll just run down just some of the more sobering statistics. So in the US Census, for example, they say that by 2030, all the baby boomers will be 65 and older. So if you're running a business, you're going to be past retirement age. 8% of the wealth has been tied up in their business or more. And this is in 2016. It was an estimate of about $10 trillion in the US was going to transfer by the time the baby boomers had finally transitioned all their businesses. So if we use, your typical 10-to-1 kind of ratio comparing Canada or US to Canada, then you could probably estimate that maybe there's about $1 trillion here in Canada. So that's a big number. And, historically, we know that a lot of businesses actually put on the market do not sell. So 70% or plus do not sell. There's also other statistics about, from the personal side, 12 months after exiting, 3 out of 4 business owners regretted selling. Okay. And then in terms of family transitions, only 30% survive into the second generation, 12% survive into the third generation, and 3% survive beyond that. So those are really kind of sobering statistics. So really, what we really need is a holistic kind of exit plan for the middle market business owner. And by holistic business plan, I mean taking a look at, number one, financial readiness, personal readiness, and business readiness. So financial readiness, that's somebody who's coming to you and saying, Jason, tell me what I need to retire. Like, what do I need to retire and how do I get there? Business readiness is really about, that's where we get into a lot more details about the valuation of the business. So I kind of analogize exit planning or business readiness. It's like you're going on a trip. So if you were planning a trip or you wanted to go from one destination to the other, you're probably going to pull your smartphone up. You're going to try to figure out, where am I right now? And then you're going to try to figure out, where am I going? And then you're going to figure out, how am I going to get there? So, in the case of let's just say you're on a vacation, you might start off wherever, but you're going to figure out based on your phone what your starting position is. You're going to figure out, where am I going? The phone will tell you sort of the most direct route, but it also give you some other alternatives. And so, for example, you may want to plan out a side trip to a winery or do this or that. And that's what kind of exit planning is. And so I analogize it when you're trying to figure out where you are now, what you really want to find out is what's the value of a business right now. And we call that a baseline valuation. And it's very important if you're going to do any sort of exit planning that you need to understand what the value of your business is now. Because for a lot of owners, they probably don't know the value of their business. They probably overestimate the value of their business. So the next step after that is to sort of figure out, okay, well, what's the potential valuation of your business? So when we take a look at there's multiple databases out there, DealStats is a really good one. There's a few others. We try to get an idea of, okay, so what's in the universe of businesses that are transacting. We have some information on their multiples. We have some information on DealStats has some really good information on some of the like the operating margins, the gross margins. We have some other benchmarking tools that we can take a look at for businesses in the industry. So by doing that, then we can figure out, okay, that's we know what the full range of what goes on within the industry, and the multiples are going to change industry by industry. But we want to have an idea of like what's sort of the top level for your industry. And then what we do is we do like a diagnostic where we go into a very detailed questionnaire with the owner or owners, and we try to figure out based on the responses. And we're really focusing in on is value drivers. We're focusing on the personal readiness. We're trying to figure out where does that business lie in terms of its potentiality? And because it's really important, for example, like in some cases, a business may not even be transferable. If there's certain characteristics to it, may not even be transferable. And then, transferability is sort of it's not a binary thing. So it's a matter of degree. And that's where sort of the multiple comes in, is that yes, it may transfer, but you may not have an optimal multiple.
So let's take a step back and unpack this for a bit, because you covered a lot here. Okay. So let's unpack each of these one at a time, right? In a little bit more detail as opposed to where we're going. So the first piece, let's actually start with personal readiness. Okay. This is something I've actually talked about quite frequently on the podcast and other podcasts, which is, I always joke that there's two financial plans. One is the financial aspect, which we'll get to in a second, of being able to pay for retirement. The other one is what the heck am I going to do with all that time? And your stat on how many people, was it 2/3 of people regret it within what a period of time? Like
3 out of 4 regret.
3 out of 4. So wow. 3 out of 4. So 75% of people regret it. And it's probably most likely due to the loss of an aspect of their identity, right? Like it's what they did for a very long time. So what and who are they now? And they haven't really planned it out. And I always tell people that you need a plan for that, because frankly, there's only so much golf you can play. And at least I can, and with terrible scores. And frankly, if you think you're going to go from working the life of an entrepreneur to stopping, that's like driving a car at 100 miles an hour and then hitting a brick wall. That's not going to go well for you. So what do you, when having these conversations around their personal readiness, like how do you develop this and get them ready for this kind of altering life change?
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. I think getting the conversation started is important. And for a lot of them, most of them have a very vague notion about what they want to do post-exit. And actually, for a lot of them, they have nothing concrete really even thought out. So my role is really during that planning stage is to start that conversation, try to figure out to what degree they've put some thought into it, and then start getting into a conversation about what some of their options are. Because, when I do work, there's sort of the planning stage and there's an implementation stage. So the planning stage, we're trying to figure out to what degree they've done any work on that post-exit planning. So, and in many cases, it's nothing. So the first implementation step may be, okay, let's in the next 90 days, why don't you come up and start coming up with a list of 3 things that you want to do when you retire. And there's a wide variety of things. And for a lot of people, because they haven't put thought into it, it gives them sort of food for thought to think about. For example, maybe they do want to get into consulting, or they want to stick around as sort of a consultant for the business. And something like that's going to actually play into the exit as well, because maybe there's an exit strategy there that fits in with that particular mindset. The other thing is, maybe for some of them, they want to start another business. For some of them, it's going to be just pure retirement. Like they start thinking about, it's going to be, I want to build that deck on the cottage that I've been putting off, or I want to develop new hobbies after I exit, because I can't sit around and be still all the time. So for every owner, it's going to be different. But so it's starting that conversation and then started to move it into a specific area, and if necessary, like there are some specialists in that area that maybe can help them out as well. So if they're really kind of stuck and that's a sticking point for them, then we can bring someone in as well to help them out. Because one of the reason why it's important is that if you don't address it, what ends up happening is that, a lot of the regrets coming from just that lack of planning. And the other thing that can happen is that you have the owner almost subconsciously maybe sabotage the exit and sort of, we heard stories from brokers and intermediaries where the owners, everything seems to be moving along and all of a sudden they just gonna get cold feet and blank out or ghost out. And the deal just doesn't end up happening is because they're just too afraid to move past that point of time. So ideally, if you've given yourself runway, and from, like I said, my runway tends to be 2+ years or more, that's a good period of time to start really thinking about and putting together an action plan to deal with your post-exit life.
So yeah, it's one thing that, frankly, in all of this, because people are just, and this has come up several times, one with Peter Merrick and a couple other guests of the podcast around finding purpose and meaning beyond work, because it is a major thing people just do not consider. You spend all this time trying to amass the wealth that's going to let you be free, and then at the end of the day, you're just now you're tied to the job so perfectly, so tightly that it's hard to separate yourself from that. So that's the personal readiness. The financial readiness, that's kind of my job. So let's talk about the financial readiness aspects of that. Someone like me is come in first and basically show them that they can do so with even, say no value or even a modest valuation for the business or a realistic one. I think that would make your life a lot easier. But what happens when that conversation hasn't happened yet? Someone tells you about wanting to get out of their business and hires you, but they haven't engaged a financial planner. What does that look like?
That is something we would identify during the early stages of our discussions. And I would say that probably the number one action item, I would say during the implementation stage is, if you don't have a financial planner, go find one. And if you do have one, have that conversation in 90 days. Let's try to get that discussion going and maybe have a retirement plan in place, because it's important, because all of this is interrelated. So if you don't have that discussion about the financial readiness and what's going on with your business, because the business valuation and everything is all tied in. So if you haven't had that discussion, if you're just focusing on the business side, which is fine, but you still don't know what number you're trying to shoot for, right? So they need to have that conversation with you to sort of have an idea of, okay, this is the retirement that I'm looking for, and these are the numbers that I'm looking for. And then, when they do the business valuation and we look at the potential value of the business, sometimes it's, the reality is a lot of times the current valuation isn't going to be matching that number that they need right now for the retirement. So hopefully if they have time, then they have time to do, some sort of value creation program to correct that value gap. But if they haven't had discussion with you or a financial planner or wealth manager, then the business improvement side is obviously always important, but they still don't know what the retirement looks like or whether that's going to be enough for them. So what my practice is about is a holistic exit planning. And it's about putting, the three legs of the stool, that personal readiness, business readiness, and financial readiness together, and making sure that you've got all those three components in place. And obviously during the implementation stages, if there's some gaps there and things that need to be filled in, then that's ideally when you have a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 year time horizon, then you can start to fill in those gaps and start to deal with those improvements. But otherwise, if you've only addressed one of those things, it's like having a stool with a wobbly leg or
going to fall over.
You're just going to fall over.
Yep. So you mentioned something earlier about whether or not the value matches what they think it is. And, as I like to say with this, everyone likes to think their baby's pretty. And unfortunately, especially when they're in a negotiation, if they're in a negotiation, then they've got every vested interest in getting the maximum dollar possible. But unfortunately, the reality is not everybody's baby is pretty. How do you deal with that? You get to meet with a business owner who says, well, yeah, I think my business is worth X. And you say to them, sorry, bud, it's like 50% of that. How do you handle that situation?
Well, the initial valuation is always a difficult conversation, because it's probably maybe the first time they've ever had a valuation of their business. And for a lot of people, they haven't been educated on how valuation works. And a lot of times they've been exposed to talking with their peers. And, there's something we call like the country club valuation or the golf club valuation, which is what they talked to one of their peers at the golf club. And they said, oh, I sold my business for 7 times cash flow. And the problem obviously with that is that, number one, we don't really know to what degree how accurate that is. Number two, people who brag are probably talking about their enterprise value. They're not necessarily talking about what the actual net proceeds were at the end of the day. And the reality is every business is going to be different. And maybe there was a very good reason why that business sold for a good multiple that has nothing to do with the existing business that we're talking about. So I tend to use that valuation as an educational point, but I also do the value driver assessment at the same time. So it's kind of like a good news, bad news thing. The bad news is your business isn't worth as much as you think it is right now. But the good news is that you can do something about it. And that's something that a lot of people don't always understand, is that they just assume that the business is whatever the value is, they have no control over. It's just, just the market that impacts them. And while there are some things that are obviously outside your control, like things like, COVID-19 or whatever, there are some other things that you as a business owner can control in terms of improving the value of your business. So what I try to do is I try to incorporate both those things together so that they can, once they've kind of got over the initial shock of what their valuation is, I want them to really understand, okay, this is what drives it. This is what's going on in the marketplace in terms of the other kind of comparable transactions. And then by looking at the value driver assessment, we can show them, but you can still improve your business. And here's some of the things that you can do. And there's different ways of kind of prioritizing that. And what we try to do is we try to incorporate that into the action plan. Specifically, what are they going to do to improve the value of the business? So there is a huge sort of educational component. I mean, it's a lot of senses. Sometimes doing evaluation, it's like going to a dentist and finding out, you need some procedures. It's not always pleasant, but the reality is that you have to do it and you deal with it. And owners need to understand is that, they don't take a passive approach towards their business. They're usually very involved with their business, and they know that they can actively involved with the strategy and the pricing and the business development. And the same thing is true for the valuation of the business. It's not a passive exercise. It's something that they can actually get involved with. So once you've helped them sort of educate them on that process, and they obviously understand what the importance of it is, which is, it's obviously a great amount of importance. Then they start to understand, okay, now there are some things that we can do. And then you start getting into the next discussion, which is, here's a list of things that we think you should do based on our assessment. And let's start talking about prioritization. And there's different ways of prioritizing. For example, you could pick like the one big rock, the one big problem that's really the main problem in the business. And then we'll deal with some of the other stuff later. Or you could start off with some easy wins. So low hanging fruit, get some victories under your belt, and then start dealing with some of the tougher stuff. Bang for your buck. There's different ways of kind of assessing the things that are important in terms of improving enterprise value. So you could organize it that way. It's going to really depend on the owner's preferences. And once they get educated on the process, they really do get actively involved in it.
Let's get onto into the business readiness case. So business readiness is probably twofold in my imagination. I'm sure you could correct me if I'm wrong here, but I would say one is from a enterprise maximization by making sure that certain numbers are being hit and whatever to make sure you get the maximum value for it. The second piece probably has to be a very operational administrative issue. Like I'm sure you walk in these situations and everything flows through the business owner, right? So there's no processes in place. Talk to me about what you most commonly see as both let's call it the quantitative and the qualitative aspects of what people need to do to get ready for the sale of the business.
That's a great question. Yeah, I think to me, the two biggest value killers in a business are going to be really a lack of separation of the owner from the business and a high degree of customer concentration. So, for example, customer concentration could be, let's just say 3 customers represent 50% of the revenues. No, that's a very risky situation. So, a prospective buyer, for example, comes along and they're going to view that as a very risky situation because in any given situation, lots of random things can happen where maybe that one of those customers disappears and all of a sudden 15 to 20% of your revenues are gone, either overnight or over a short period of time. Those would be probably the most critical thing. So what I try to do is try to focus in on, okay, do we have a customer concentration problem? And that's something we'll identify right during the valuation. There's a separate assessment we can do in terms of the owner separation. But that's an example where, number one, the owner has to be basically involved with everything. And I asked them, like, can you take a vacation and put the phone away? And if they can't do that, then there's probably some degree of owner dependence. Because ideally where you want to be in a perfect situation would be you're managing that process, you're developing the strategy for the business, but your management team and everybody underneath them is running the business on a day-to-day basis. And if you disappear for a couple of days, that machine still runs. For a lot of lower middle market businesses, and that's probably $5 million to $50 million in revenue, that's a difficult situation. So if we do identify, that's probably the biggest rock that would have to be dealt with. So number one is the owner actively involved with the processes? The second aspect of that is there documentation of those processes? And that's important because if a prospective buyer comes along and they want to buy the business. If everything's sitting up in the owner's head, it's going to be very difficult for them to try to, unless it's a very intuitive business, it's going to be difficult for them to understand that business. And so it's either going to reflect poorly on what they're going to offer in terms of the multiple, or they just won't put a bid on it. Like the business just won't transfer. So those are the two most critical things. And then it also really gets in from an organizational perspective, to what degree does the top-down communication and bottom-up communication work? So top-down is the owner is the one who's supposed to be driving the strategy. So how do they communicate that to management, and how does management communicate that to the employees? On the other side of the equation, understanding what's going on with the customers and customer satisfaction, customer feedback is important. And it's the frontline employees who are the people who are getting that feedback. So what's the process for them to communicate upwards up to management? So we'll have conversations about that. On the quantitative side, obviously I come from a financial background, so I'll ask a lot of questions about what's going on with their financials. And for a lot of those businesses, those owners are only going to look at their financials once a year. And frankly, that's not enough. Now, they may think they have a grip on what's going on, but the reality is that if you're going to go through some sort of value creation program, you need to understand, where's your business going to go over the next couple of years? Certainly need to have an understanding of what's going on in the next 12 months. If you're growing your business, your working capital is probably growing too. So do you have a grip on that? Most of business owners don't understand. They implicitly understand working capital, why they need to manage it, but they don't do it. So the working capital is probably not the most efficiently operated. And there's, again, that's where the benchmarking comes in, is that we can kind of help them out with that. On the CapEx side, have they deferred CapEx, capital expenditures? Because that's a situation that's, it's going to impact the valuation, like a prospective buyers. If it's assuming it's a capital intensive business, they're not going to be fooled by that. They're going to ask those questions during the due diligence. So if you those type of things where you've kind of permanently deferred your capital expenditures, that's something that needs to be addressed as well. Things that I help them out with would be, like, for example, developing KPIs, key performance indicators. And you can do that both on the financial side and the operations side. If you haven't developed those type of metrics on the financial side, chances are you probably haven't done it on the operations side either. And that's going to be important because, assuming you're like a manufacturer or maybe a wholesaler, you probably want to understand what's going on with in terms of your efficiency and in terms of how you're handling orders, et cetera. So, you need to start getting a grip on that. So those are the type of things that are really important, because if you're going to grow your business, first of all, and it boils down to, like we talked about, the valuation, sort of knowing where you are and where you're going. It's the same thing with those metrics. You need to understand, like, what's the state of my operations, and based on various metrics. And then are those good metrics or those bad? Is there room for improvement? And then the question is, okay, let's try to figure out what the targets are. And then you need to start having a process to measure them to get to where you're going. Because if you don't measure them, then you're not really accomplishing too much of anything.
So we covered a fair amount there, specifically around the key areas. So, to recap those key areas in layman's terms, not as eloquently as you put it down. One is knowing what you're going to do with your time when you do retire. Two, being able to actually retire financially. And the last one is basically having your business in the most ready method or most ready state for maximization of enterprise value when you retire. And this is something that you guide people through a process in order to make sure they address those drivers. Fantastic. So, David, thank you very much for this. It's been informative, and I'm sure I get some people reaching out to you. Where can people find you?
They can reach out to me at value@velorum.ca. So that's VELORUM.ca. To send me an email. I'm happy to talk with anybody.
David, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
So that was this week's episode of Financial Planning for Canadian Business Owners. I hope you enjoyed that. And as always, if you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever it is you get your podcasts. And until next time, take care.
This podcast was brought to you by Woodgate Financial, an award-winning financial planning firm catering to high net worth individuals, business owners, and their families. To learn more, go to woodgate.com. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify, or find more episodes at jasonpereira.ca. You can even ask Siri, Alexa, or Google Home to subscribe for you.